Margaret Colley Denholm did not scream. She did not weep. She did not ask him to repeat himself, though the words had come to her second hand, through a doorway left open by carelessness rather than cruelty, which was somehow worse. She stood in the flooded nave of Sallow Mill, with water past her ankles and her good grey boots ruined beyond saving, and she took the iron sluice key from the nail where old Corrigan kept it, and she looped its cord around her wrist twice, and she pulled it tight. The water in the mill race was the colour of strong tea, and it moved past her with the low patient sound of something that had been doing this for 300 years, and intended to go on doing it. Somewhere behind her, in the direction of Denholm Park, a supper was still being eaten. Somewhere in that supper a woman named Ottilie Vane was sitting in the chair that had until 9 days ago been Margaret's own, at the right hand of a man who had said, in front of 11 guests and a housekeeper and a footman holding a decanter of claret, that his wife was suitable, that she had always been suitable. That suitability was not the same as being loved, but that it would do, and had done, for 2 years, and would go on doing for as many years as required. By morning she would be gone from the house that bore her husband's name, and he would spend the better part of 2 years learning the difference between a wife who was merely present and a woman who had simply been waiting for a reason to stop being patient. He did not know that yet. Nobody did. The water did not know it either, and went on running toward the broken sluice the way it always had, indifferent, the way water is. The autumn of 1819 had come to the county of Renwick the way it always did, heavy and gold, and a little melancholy, the hedgerows thick with hips, and the harvest carts groaning down the lanes toward Denholm Park's great barns. Margaret had married Julian Denholm 2 years before that, in a spring wedding arranged with the efficiency of a land transfer, which in most of the particulars it had been. Her father, a modest gentleman who had owned and worked a mill of his own before a fever took him, had left her £4,000, and a habit of reading ledgers the way other young women read novels. Julian's family had needed the £4,000 rather badly, though nobody said so at the wedding breakfast, where everyone instead remarked on what a sensible match it was, and how well suited the young baronet and his bride appeared. She had been, in the 2 years since, the kind of wife whose competence made her invisible. She kept the household accounts to the farthing, and found in her first winter an error of £11 a quarter that the previous housekeeper had been quietly pocketing for 6 years. She negotiated with the tenant farmers over the Michaelmas rents in a voice so calm and so exactly informed that old men who had farmed Denholm land for 40 years began, without quite noticing they had begun, to bring their disputes to her rather than to the steward. She learned the names of every child in every cottage on the estate. She learned which fields flooded in a wet spring and which held their water in a dry one. None of it showed. That was the particular cruelty of the kind of work she did. It was measured by nothing going wrong, and nothing going wrong looks, to a man who has never had to make it so, exactly like nothing happening at all. Julian was not unkind to her. That was the thing she would have had to explain to anyone who asked, in the weeks after, and no one asked, because no one thought a woman standing in a ruined mill deserved an explanation before they offered their sympathy or their scorn. He was not unkind. He was absent in the particular way of a man guarding something in himself so carefully that he had forgotten what it was for. He had inherited Denholm Park at 19, on the day his father was found in the counting room, with the estate's debts spread before him, and a letter, unfinished, to a woman who was not his wife. Julian's mother had left when he was 7, not died, left taken a smaller income and a smaller house 40 miles off and never sent for him, and his father had raised him on the doctrine, stated plainly and often, that love was a debt a sensible man did not extend credit against. Marry for land. Keep your affections where they cannot be foreclosed upon. Julian had absorbed this the way a boy absorbs the shape of a room he has grown up in, without ever quite seeing the walls. Mrs. Ottilie Vane had arrived at Denholm Park in the spring of the second year, a young widow and a distant cousin of Julian's late mother, ostensibly to serve as companion to his ailing aunt. The aunt died in July. Mrs. Vane did not leave. She was warm in the particular way of a fire that has been laid with great skill to look accidental, and she was patient, and she was, Margaret had noted early, and without any particular alarm, extremely interested in the estate's ledgers for a woman who claimed no head for figures. By the harvest supper of that September, Julian had stopped consulting his wife about anything that mattered, and started consulting Mrs. Vane about everything that did not, which had the curious effect of making it look, to a county that judged by appearances, as though the reverse were true. Margaret watched this happen with the flat, cataloguing attention she gave to a field going slowly to weed. She said nothing. She waited to see what the pattern would resolve into. She did not yet know that the resolution would come at a harvest supper, over the second remove, in a voice her husband did not trouble to lower, because he did not yet understand that some doors are only half closed. The supper had been laid for 11, in the long dining-room at Denholm Park, with its tall windows going grey with early dusk, and Margaret had come down late, delayed by a tenant's letter about a collapsed drainage ditch that could not, in her judgment, wait until morning to be answered. She entered through the garden door, meaning to slip in quietly at the foot of the table, and stopped instead in the unlit passage outside the dining-room, because her own name was being spoken inside it. Lady Denholm manages the accounts admirably, Julian was saying, in the easy, unguarded voice he used only when he believed himself among people who required no performance from him. She is suitable. She has always been suitable. It is not, perhaps, the same thing as being loved, but it does the office, and has done, and I find a man of sense asks for little more than that his affairs run smoothly. There was a small ripple of laughter, the comfortable laughter of people who have not understood they have just said something unforgivable, and beneath it, unmistakably, Mrs. Vane's low reply, how fortunate for her to be so very useful. Margaret stood in the dark passage with her hand flat against the cold plaster and did not move for the length of 11 breaths, which she counted, because counting was a thing she had taught herself to do, with anything too large to feel all at once. She did not go in. She went instead to the small sitting-room, where the mantel clock kept better time than any other in the house, and she sat, and she allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to feel the entire shape of it, the 2 years, the ledgers, the £11 a quarter, the children's names, the suitability of her, laid out for a room like a horse's soundness, and at the end of the 10 minutes she stood, smoothed her skirt, and went to find her husband. She did not confront him at the table. That was not her method, and never would be. She waited until the guests had gone, until the house had gone quiet around its 2 remaining occupants like a held breath, and she asked him, in the library, whether it was true that Mrs. Vane was to take charge of the household accounts going forward, as she had heard mentioned twice that evening by guests who assumed she already knew. Julian did not deny it. That, more than the words in the passage, was the thing she carried out of the room with her. He explained, reasonably, that Mrs. Vane had a talent for management he had come to rely upon. that it would ease matters considerably if Margaret were to remove for a time to Sallow Mill on the estate's northern boundary. The air there was said to be beneficial, he had heard, for a woman's nerves, and that nothing about the arrangement need be spoken of as anything other than sensible. Sensible, Margaret repeated. You have always been the most sensible woman I know, Julian said, meaning it, apparently, as praise. She looked at him for a long moment, a man she had shared a bed and a breakfast table and 400 and some odd mornings with, and had never once, she understood now, been permitted to be more to than a well-kept ledger, and she said only, "Then you will not object if I take the mill's key with me? It is, I believe, the one thing on this estate no one else has ever wanted." She left at first light, in a hired cart, with 2 trunks and her mother's sewing box and her father's old accounting books, and she did not look back at the house, because looking back was not. She had decided somewhere in the 10 minutes by the mantel clock, a thing she intended to spend any further part of her life doing. Sallow Mill stood a mile and a half north along the River Idden, a squat grey stone building with a broken sluice gate and 8 inches of standing water across its ground floor, abandoned to disuse since old Corrigan's employer had died without troubling to replace him. Corrigan himself still lived in the cottage attached to it, a bent, sharp-eyed man of perhaps 70, who had milled grain on the Idon for 50 years and had opinions freely given about everyone who had ever mismanaged the estate that employed him. "Come to see the ruin, my lady?" he asked, when her cart drew up. "Come to live in it," Margaret said, "and to see what's wrong with the gate." Corrigan looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at a horse he is deciding whether to trust with a bad leg. "Sluice timbers rotted through 8 years back," he said. "Nobody in that house cared to spend the £40 to mend it, not when there was a new drive to be laid at the front of the park instead." £40, Margaret said, and something in her settled, the way it settled over a column of figures that were about to be made to add up correctly. "I have considerably more than £40, Mr. Corrigan, and considerably more time than I did yesterday. Will you show me the gate?" He did not answer with words. He turned and walked toward the mill race, and after a moment, without quite deciding to, she followed him. Her ruined boots sucking at the wet stone floor, the water moving past her the way it had moved past everyone at Denholm Park for 300 years, patient, indifferent, and, she was beginning to understand, standing there with the key still knotted at her wrist, entirely hers to command if she was only willing to learn how. The gate, Corrigan explained over the following week, was not so much broken as neglected into ruin, which he seemed to regard as a moral distinction of some importance. The upright timbers had rotted where they met the stone footing. The iron pins that should have held the paddles true had rusted and sprung. The leat above the wheel had silted with 8 years of leaves and gravel, until the water no longer struck the wheel with any force worth the name. None of it, he said, was beyond mending. All of it required money and labour and a person willing to stand in cold water in October directing both. Margaret had £400 of her own, kept separate from the estate accounts in a Renwick bank since before her marriage. On the advice of her father, who had told her once, in the particular flat voice he used for things he meant her to remember, that a woman ought always to keep one door that was hers alone to open. She spent £31 of it in the first fortnight on new oak for the sluice timbers and iron for the pins, and she paid the 2 labourers who came to fit them 9 shillings a week, rather than the 6 that was customary on the Denholm estate. A fact that travelled through Iddenbridge and the surrounding hamlets faster than the work itself did. "You'll ruin every mill owner in the county paying wages like that," Corrigan told her, not entirely disapproving. "I intend to ruin exactly one," Margaret said, and did not explain further, because she did not yet know herself which one she meant, the man who had let a mill rot for the price of a driveway, or the woman who was, at that moment, learning to keep his house. She learned to read the mill race the way she had once learned to read a rent roll, patiently, methodically, asking Corrigan the same question in 4 different ways, until she understood not merely the answer, but the reasoning beneath it. She learned that the wheel's speed could be governed by the sluice gate's height to within an inch, that too much water spent as much force as too little, that the whole art of milling was a negotiation between what the river wanted to do and what the miller needed it to do, conducted daily, with no room for sentiment on either side. By the first week of November the gate held. By the second the wheel turned, slowly at first, groaning on its old axle, then with increasing confidence, until the great oak paddles were striking the water with a steady, satisfying rhythm that could be heard from the Iddenbridge Road on a still evening. Margaret stood in the mill's doorway the first time it ran a full hour without faltering, and found that her hands, when she looked down at them, were shaking slightly, not with cold. "Well," Corrigan said, from behind her, in the tone of a man delivering, for him, a standing ovation. "There's a wheel." "There's a wheel," Margaret agreed. "Now let us see what it can grind." The first sacks of flour that Sallow Mill produced under Margaret's hand were, by Corrigan's own grudging admission, better than anything the mill had turned out in a decade, and she sold them at a fair rate to the bakers of Iddenbridge and 2 of the smaller inns along the Renwick Road, undercutting nothing, simply delivering, reliably, a product that had not been reliably available in the district in years. Word of a lady running a mill spread the way gossip moves through a county, which is the way water moves downhill, finding every low place and filling it first. Some of it was unkind. A good deal more of it, within a month, was curious, and curiosity, Margaret had learned from her father's ledgers, was the beginning of every profitable arrangement she had ever seen conducted. Julian Denholm rode past Sallow Mill on the 14th of November, on his way to inspect a boundary dispute at the estate's northern edge, and stopped his horse in the road when he heard the wheel turning and saw smoke rising steady and domestic from the cottage chimney. He did not dismount. He sat for perhaps 2 minutes, looking at a building he had been told, by his own steward, was not worth the cost of mending, now running with a confidence it had not shown in a decade. And then he rode on, and said nothing of it to anyone at Denholm Park, though Margaret heard from Corrigan's grandson, who had it from a stable boy, that the master had asked, quite casually, whether the mill's account books were kept anywhere he might see them. She did not send them. Not yet. There is a particular stillness to a man doing arithmetic he does not enjoy, and Margaret had decided. Standing in her mill with flour dust settled fine as pollen on every surface, that she was in no hurry at all to spare him the sum. The second competence trial came in January, when the Denholm estate's own mill at the park, a larger, better situated operation that had, since Michaelmas, been under the informal supervision of Mrs. Ottilie Vane, who had persuaded Julian that she possessed a talent for such things, began to fall behind on its deliveries to the same Iddenbridge bakers Margaret already served. The estate mill's miller, a sour, overworked man named Fettle, was paid the estate's customary 6 shillings a week, and had, under Mrs. Vane's economies, seen his 2 assistants let go entirely. Sacks went out late, then underweight, then not at all, for a full fortnight, when the estate wheel's bearings ceased, for want of the greasing fettle, no longer had the hands to spare for. Margaret did not seek the business. She had not needed to. The bakers came to her, quietly at first, and then without any particular discretion, and by the end of January Sallow Mill was supplying more than half of Iddenbridge's bread grain, at a fair price, with wages posted openly on the mill door, 9 shillings a week, a fact Mrs. Vane's economies had made into something very like a public accusation, though Margaret had never once spoken Mrs. Vane's name aloud to a soul in the district. It was Julian's younger sister, Louisa, 17 and largely ignored by everyone at Denholm Park, who might otherwise have found a use for her opinions, who rode out to Sallow Mill on a grey February afternoon, and asked, without preamble, whether she might see how the wheel worked. "You are the first person from that house to ask me anything at all since September," Margaret said, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she meant it kindly rather than bitterly. Louisa flushed. "Julian asks about you," she said. "He doesn't ask me, precisely. He asks Mrs. Fettle whether the roads to Sallow are passable. And he asks the steward what the mill's returns were this quarter, and he thinks no one has noticed that he asks at all." She hesitated, twisting her glove in her hands. "He isn't unkind, you know. I don't think he knows how to be anything but careful. Our mother," she stopped. "Your mother," Margaret prompted, gently, because she had learned that the gentlest question often did the most work. "She left when he was 7, Louisa said. Father never let anyone speak of it. He used to tell Julian that a sensible man keeps his heart where it cannot be repossessed, the way he'd talk about land, as though love were a debt one ought never extend without security." She looked up, unhappy. "I think Julian married you because you seemed like security, Lady Denholm. I don't think he ever meant it as an insult. I think it may have been the closest thing to a compliment he knew how to pay." Margaret said nothing for a long moment, turning this over the way she turned over a column of figures that did not, at first glance, balance. "That is not a compliment, Louisa," she said finally. "It is a diagnosis. But I thank you for bringing it to me plainly. Plain things are easier to work with than pretty ones." She showed Louisa the wheel, and the sluice, and the ledger where she recorded every sack milled and every shilling paid. And Louisa, left at dusk with flour on her cuffs and, though neither of them named it so, the beginning of an alliance that would matter a great deal before the year was through. It was in March that the first paper moved. Mrs. Vane. Margaret learned through Corrigan, who had it from a carter who had it from a maid at the park, had begun quietly asking the estate's steward, a nervous, overworked man named Simon Crane, about the precise terms of Margaret's dower rights, whether the mill and its surrounding acreage had ever been formally settled upon her, or whether it remained, as most of the estate did, entirely within Julian's gift to dispose of, as he saw fit. Margaret received this information the way she received most information now, without visible alarm, and with an immediate private accounting of what she did and did not yet have proof of. She did not yet have proof of anything. She had a wheel, a ledger, 40 sacks of flour a week, and a growing suspicion, sharp and cold as the water in the mill race, that Mrs. Vane intended to have the mill declared unentailed and sold out from under her before the year was out, and that whatever document would be required to accomplish that would not be an honest one. She wrote nothing of this in a letter. She began instead, that same week, a private ledger of her own, separate from the mill's accounts, kept in a drawer with a lock whose key she wore now alongside the sluice key on its cord, in which she recorded, dated and precise, every rumour, every visit, every scrap of Mrs. Vane's interest in Sallow Mill's legal standing, in the plain, unadorned hand her father had taught her, because a document, he had told her once, is worth nothing until someone troubles to keep it. Julian came to the mill himself on the last evening of March, unannounced, on foot rather than horseback, which she noted and filed away as meaning something, though she was not yet certain what. He stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands, turning it slowly, the way a man turns something he does not know how to set down. "The wheel runs well," he said. "It does," Margaret said, not rising from the ledger table. "Better than the Parks." Considerably, he was quiet for a moment. "Ottilie tells me the mill was never properly settled on you, that it remains, in law, mine to dispose of." "Ottilie is correct on the law," Margaret said, "and wrong about a great many other things. Is that why you've come? To dispose of it?" "No," Julian said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, the first unrehearsed sound she had heard from him in a year. He stopped, started again. "I've come because I stood in my own hall tonight and watched a woman manage my household with none of the. He stopped a second time, and this time did not find the word at all. "None of what, Julian?" Margaret said, quietly, not unkindly, but with the particular precision of a woman who had waited a long time to ask a question, and did not intend to let it go unanswered now that she finally had. "None of the quiet," he said at last. "The house is very loud now, and I find I do not care for it." Margaret set down her pen. "I am not interested in being missed the way one misses silence, Julian. I have spent 2 years being useful in a house that mistook usefulness for love, and I will not trade a flooded mill I built with my own hands for the privilege of being that again." "Then what would you trade it for?" he asked, and it was, she noted, the first real question he had ever asked her. "Nothing tonight," she said, "and not for words. If you want to know what I would trade it for, Julian, you will have to show me over time, and I will have to watch you do it, and neither of us is owed the answer before the work is done." He nodded slowly, and set his hat back on his head, and turned to go, and at the door he stopped, and looked back at the wheel turning steady and sure in the dark water behind her, and said, "I never asked what the mill needed, I only heard what it cost." That, Margaret said, was always the trouble. He left without another word, and she sat a long while after he had gone, listening to the wheel, before she took the sluice key from her wrist for the first time in 6 months, and set it, not away, but on the table beside her, where in the morning she found she had. Without quite deciding to, left it lying beside a second key, a plain iron duplicate Julian must have had cut, and left there while her back was turned, fitted to the same lock, waiting to see whether she would ever choose to use it. The confession, when it came from Simon Crane, and it came badly, the way confessions of that kind generally do. Not as an act of courage, but as an act of terror, in the 2nd week of May, when Crane arrived at Sallow Mill white-faced and rain-soaked, and asked to speak to Margaret alone. "I did a thing I oughtn't," he said, standing in her doorway with his hat crushed in both hands, unable to meet her eyes. "Mrs. Vane brought me a letter this winter, said it was found among old Mr. Colley's papers, your father's papers, my lady, sent on from the solicitor who settled his estate. Said it showed your father had meant to leave the mill and its land free of any entail, to be disposed of at the family's discretion, should you ever remarry, or should the marriage," he stopped, swallowed, "should the marriage prove unsatisfactory to Sir Julian." I copied the hand onto new paper at her direction, to make the ink look aged. I am not proud of it. I have not slept a full night since I did it." Margaret felt the room go very still around her, the way it did over a column that did not balance and would not balance until the error was found. "Where is the original letter now, Mr. Crane? Burned?" he said miserably. "She had me burn it after I'd copied the hand. There was never any real letter, my lady. Your father never wrote such a thing. I know it because the hand I copied wasn't his. She gave me a sample from an old rent receipt to work from, and the sample and the letter she wanted forged weren't in the same hand at all. I noticed it and said nothing, because she'd paid off a debt of mine at the Iddenbridge Tavern, and I was frightened of what would happen if I refused her a second time." "And the forged letter," Margaret said. "Where is it now?" "With her solicitor in Renwick," Crane said. "She means to have it read at the quarter sessions, my lady, at the audit before the whole county, this Michaelmas, to prove the mill unentailed and Sir Julian free to dispose of it as a gift, and to have witnesses present when he does." Margaret sat with this for a long moment, turning it the way she turned every fact that arrived without warning, sorting it into what she could prove and what she could not. "You will need to tell this to Mr. Penrose, the solicitor in Renwick who handles my own affairs," she said finally. "Not to protect yourself, Mr. Crane. You have earned no protection yet, but because a true account, given freely now, is worth a great deal more than a false one burned in the past. What you do with the next month will matter more than what you did last winter. I suggest you spend it usefully." Crane left with the particular unsteady gratitude of a man who has been given a chance he did not expect and is not yet sure he deserves, and Margaret went that same week to Renwick to see Mr. Aldous Penrose, a precise, grey, entirely unimpressible man who had managed her father's affairs for 20 years and hers since his death, and laid before him her private ledger, 6 months of dated observations, Crane's account taken down and signed, the true rent receipt Crane had described, procured that same week from the estate's own records, and a request for a formal comparison of hands to be prepared by an independent clerk before the quarter sessions in September. "This will not be gentle," Penrose said, reading it over with his spectacles low on his nose. "I have not asked for gentle," Margaret said. "I have asked for accurate. Mrs. Vane's counterpunch arrived in June, and it was, as Margaret had expected, aimed not at the mill but at her name. A sworn statement began circulating through the drawing-rooms of Renwick, never traced directly to Mrs. Vane, though its origin was not seriously in doubt to anyone who troubled to think about it, alleging that Lady Denholm had abandoned her marriage bed of her own choosing, had taken up trade beneath her station out of spite rather than necessity, and had, in the privacy of her mill, entertained Mr. Corrigan's grandson and other labouring men at hours no respectable woman ought to keep. It was a small, mean, effective piece of work, calculated to cost Margaret exactly what a forged letter could not touch, the county's good opinion. Margaret read the worst of it, second-hand, in a letter from Louisa, sitting at her ledger table with the sluice key and its unused twin lying side by side before her. She did not weep. She did not write an angry reply. She read it twice, folded it precisely, and said aloud, to the empty mill and the turning wheel, and no one at all right. Then we will do it the long way, and went back to her ledger, because there was flour to weigh and a county to convince, and she had learned over the long winter that the second was best accomplished by means of the first. The quarter-day audit at Denholm Park had, for as long as anyone could recall, been the one occasion each year when the whole of the estate's business was laid open before its tenants, rents received, wages paid, disputes settled, conducted in the great hall, with the doors standing open to whoever cared to come in from the yard. Julian had never troubled to attend in person before that September. His father had not before him. It was, everyone understood without saying so, an occasion designed to be survived rather than watched. Margaret arrived at 11 in the morning with Penrose beside her and a leather case under her arm, and took a seat not at the back, where a woman in her position might have been expected to sit, but at the long table itself, beside the magistrate, Sir Robert Ives, who had ridden over from Renwick at Penrose's quiet request to preside over what promised to be a somewhat unusual quarter day. Julian sat at the head of the table, pale, and Mrs. Vane sat near him in a gown the colour of good claret, composed, faintly amused. The way a woman is amused who believes she still holds every card in the hand. The hall filled steadily through the morning. Tenants come to settle their rents, tradesmen come to be paid, and, drawn by 6 months of quiet rumour that something at Denholm Park was finally about to be reckoned honestly, a good deal of the county besides, until the doors stood crowded, and the yard beyond held as many again. The rents were settled first, ordinary business, Margaret watching Julian conduct it with a steadiness she noted and did not yet trust. It was Sir Robert Ives who, at Penrose's earlier request, raised the matter of Sallow Mill's disputed settlement before the assembly could disperse, asking, in the flat procedural voice of a man who cared for nothing but the correctness of a record, whether the letter alleged to establish the mill's unentailed status might now be produced for examination, as had been promised. Mrs. Vane produced it without hesitation, smooth as poured cream, and handed it to the magistrate with the confidence of a woman who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her own mind, and never once imagined losing it. "I should like it compared," Margaret said, rising, her voice carrying without effort to every corner of the crowded hall, to a sample of my father's true hand, taken from the Renwick Land Registry, examined this past month by an independent clerk of the court. I have his sworn findings here, along with the account of the man who copied the forgery, given freely, and signed in this same county 3 weeks ago. The hall went very still. Mrs. Vane's composure did not break. Not yet. It only tightened, the particular stillness of a woman doing arithmetic she very much disliked, but Margaret saw Julian's eyes move from the letter in the magistrate's hands to his wife's face, and stay there. "I should also like it noted," Margaret went on, before anyone could object, "that Sallow Mill has, in the past 10 months, paid its labourers 9 shillings a week, where the park's own mill, under different management, paid 6, and let 2 men go entirely. I would ask any man in this hall who has worked for me this year to say, in his own words, whether he found my ledgers honest." She had not needed to arrange for this. She had only needed to ask once, quietly, of Corrigan the week before, whether any of the men might be willing to speak if called upon, and word had travelled the way it always did in that county, like water finding the low ground, so that when she sat down, 3 men rose unbidden from among the tenants at the back of the hall, Corrigan himself. His grandson Davy, and Ezra Coombs, a tenant farmer who had brought his grain to Sallow Mill every week since November, and had never once, he said plainly, been shorted a pound of flour or a fair word. The clerk's comparison was read aloud next, the forged letters hand shown, side by side, unmistakably distinct from the true sample drawn from the land registry. And then Simon Crane's signed account, read by Penrose in a flat, unemotional voice that made its contents somehow worse for the lack of drama in the telling. It was Sir Robert Ives who turned, finally, to Mrs. Vane and asked her, directly, before the assembled hall, whether she wished to offer any account of how a forged letter, purporting to be 20 years old, had come to bear a hand that matched no sample of the deceased Mr. Colley's writing anywhere on record. Mrs. Vane did not answer at once. Margaret watched something behind the woman's practised warmth go out, all at once, like a candle in a draught, and understood that this, not the letter, not the ledger, but this single held silence in front of a hall full of the county's own tenants, was the moment the whole of it actually turned. "I acted," Mrs. Vane said finally, "in what I believed to be a reasonable interest." "You acted," Margaret said, standing again, her voice entirely level, "in your own interest, Mrs. Vane, and dressed it as reason, because reason travels further in polite company than honesty does. I could ask Sir Robert to see this matter forwarded for prosecution as forgery, and I believe, from what Mr. Penrose tells me of the law, that I would very likely succeed." She paused, and let the hall feel the full weight of what she was choosing not to do. "I will not. I have no wish to make a spectacle of ruin out of a woman whose worst crime was believing that other people's honest work was hers to steal. I ask only that Mrs. Vane quit this county within the month, that she make no further claim upon Sallow Mill or any part of the Denholm estate, and that this hall understand plainly why." There was a long moment of silence, and then, from somewhere near the back, an old woman's voice, no one Margaret ever identified with certainty, said, "Well, there it is then," in the flat, satisfied tone of a jury, delivering a verdict it had privately reached some time before. And the hall exhaled, and Margaret sat down at last, and found that her hands, for the first time in 10 months, were entirely steady. The explanation Julian gave her did not come that night nor the next, but 4 days later, in the mill at dusk, when he came on foot again with his hat in his hands, and stood a long while before he spoke. "I am not here to apologize," he said. "That is, I intend to. But I understand now that an apology and an explanation are not the same thing, and I owe you both. And I would rather give them to you separately than let one do the work of two." "That," Margaret said, "is the first entirely correct thing you have said to me in 3 years. He told her then, standing in the mill doorway with the wheel turning steady behind her, the whole of it, his mother's leaving, his father's counting-room doctrine, the years of being taught that love extended on credit was love a sensible man could not afford. He told her that he had married her believing suitability was the safest available substitute for a thing he had never learned to trust, and that he had drifted toward Ottilie Vane's warmth precisely because it asked nothing real of him, cost him nothing, and could therefore never be taken away the way his mother's love had been. It is not an excuse, he said. I want to be clear that I do not offer it as one. It is only the truth of how I became a man who could say, in his own dining room, that his wife was suitable, and think he had paid her a compliment. It is not an excuse, Margaret agreed. But I will take it as an explanation, which I asked for, and which is worth having. Now I will tell you my terms, and I will only say them once, so I would ask you to listen carefully. She itemized them the way she itemized everything, plainly in order, that Sallow Mill would be formally settled upon her outright, by deed, regardless of what became of her marriage, that she would hold equal authority over the household and estate ledgers, not as a courtesy extended by him, but as a right recorded in writing, that the wages posted at Sallow Mill, 9 shillings, not 6, would become the standard across the whole of the Denholm estate, that he would never again make a decision touching her work, her name, or her mill without consulting her first, and that if he slipped, From habit rather than malice, she expected him to be told so, and to correct it without argument. "And," she said, "you will not tell me you love me tonight. I would not believe you if you did, and I do not think you would entirely believe yourself. You may tell me that when you have shown me, and not before." Julian was quiet a long moment. Then, "All right," he said. "All right then," Margaret said, and that, though neither of them said so aloud, was the whole of the treaty. Simon Crane came to her a final time that autumn, not to confess but to ask, humbly, whether he might keep his position as steward under her direct authority rather than Julian's, "for I trust your ledgers, my lady. In a way I never learned to trust the wanting of a thing before I'd counted its cost." Margaret considered him for a long moment, a frightened man who had done a cowardly thing and then, when it mattered most, told the truth about it anyway, and told him he might, on the condition that every book he kept from that day forward would be open to her inspection, without notice, forever. He agreed at once, with the particular relief of a man who has been given a harder penance than he expected, and finds, to his own surprise, that he is grateful for it. The proof came, as Margaret had always known it would, in ordinary days rather than grand ones. In October, Julian rode to Sallow Mill 3 mornings out of 5, not to inspect it, but to work in it, learning the language of sluice gates and grain moisture and hopper feed the way a much younger man learns a trade, badly at first, then less badly, under Corrigan's dry and entirely unsentimental instruction. In November he moved a second chair into the mill's small office, beside her own, and began keeping half the ledgers himself, in a hand that grew steadily neater as the weeks went by, because she had told him once, without heat, that untidy figures were the mark of a man who did not yet believe his work mattered enough to be legible. In December, at a dinner given at Denholm Park for the county's principal families, Julian, asked by a guest whether the flour on the table had come from the estate's own mill, said, "It came from my wife's mill, which is the finer of the two. And I would be obliged if you would tell her so yourself, since she does not care to hear it from me alone," and Margaret, watching from across the table, allowed herself, for the first time in 15 months, something very close to a laugh. The relapse came in January, small and unremarkable, the way relapses generally are. A tenant's rent fell short, and Julian, from long habit, agreed on his own to forgive half of it, rather than consulting Margaret about the tenant's actual circumstances first, and mentioned it to her afterward as an accomplished kindness, rather than a decision that had been hers by right to share. "You did that alone," Margaret said, not sharply, but plainly, the way she said everything that mattered. Julian stopped, and she watched him actually hear it, rather than merely absorb it and move past. "I did," he said. "Old habit. I am sorry, not for the forgiveness which I believe was right, but for making the decision as though your name were not on the same deed as mine." He paused. "I will go to the tenant tomorrow and tell him the decision was made jointly, because it ought to have been, and was not, and that is a fault I intend to correct rather than repeat." He did exactly that, the following morning, and told her so afterward without being asked, and Margaret marked it in her private ledger, not as a fault entered against him, but as the first entry in a new column entirely, one she had not needed before. Proof. It was in February, nearly a year and a half after the harvest supper, that Julian said the thing she had told him not to say until he could mean it fully, and by then she believed him. "I would choose you," he said, standing in the mill doorway with the wheel turning behind him this time, rather than behind her, the two of them having traded places somewhere in the long months between. I have been choosing you for some time now, if I am honest, since the night I left a second key on your table and did not have the courage to say why. I only wanted, before I said it aloud, to be a man worth the choosing. You said once that I was suitable, Margaret told him, and that it would do. I have thought of that sentence nearly every day for 1.5 years. I was wrong on both counts, Julian said. You were never merely suitable, and dough was never going to be enough for what I owe you, or for what I have come, very slowly and very late, to feel. That, Margaret said, is an explanation and an apology both, and I find I will accept them together, this once. 2 years passed, counted the way Margaret counted most things, in concrete units rather than vague feeling. 2 harvests, 2 Michaelmas rent days, 40 months of ledgers kept jointly and legibly, a 9-shilling wage that had become, without any further argument, simply the wage paid on every acre of the Denholm estate. Sallow Mill stood formally deeded in Margaret's own name, its fair wage board nailed permanently beside its door, where every labourer in the district could read it for himself, and beside the mill. In the spring of the second year, a small stone schoolhouse went up at Margaret's direction, where Corrigan's grandson Davy and 6 other mill children learned their letters and their sums 3 mornings a week, funded out of the mill's own profits, a thing Margaret had written into the mill's founding deed, so that no future owner, however careless, could ever again let it lapse for the price of a driveway. Mrs. Vane had gone north within the month, as required, and was said, by the infrequent letters that reached Renwick, to be living quietly and respectably enough on a small independent income, which Margaret had, in the end, arranged to see settled on her. Not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of a settled conviction that mercy dispensed from strength cost the giver something real, and was worth less if it did not. Simon Crane kept the Denholm ledgers still, open to inspection without notice, and had not, in 2 years, given Margaret a single reason to regret the trust. Louisa married, the following autumn, a quiet, capable young solicitor's clerk of Penrose's acquaintance, who had first come to her notice, standing beside Margaret at the quarter sessions, and told anyone who asked that she had learned, watching her sister-in-law that September morning, exactly what sort of man she intended to marry, and exactly what sort she did not. The sluice key hung, by the second spring, on a small brass hook beside the mill's office door, no longer worn on anyone's wrist, because it no longer needed to be carried like a weapon or a wound. Julian had had a second, smaller key cast from the same iron the year before, and given it not back to Margaret, who had never truly needed a duplicate, but to Davy Corrigan, the day the boy turned 12, and was formally apprenticed to run the gate himself one day, so that the key that had once locked a woman out of the only life anyone believed she deserved now hung instead as the plainest possible proof that a door, once opened honestly, could be trusted to stay that way. Denholm Park itself, that second spring, no longer held its breath the way it once had. The rooms Margaret had once managed like a ledger she was never permitted to sign, now bore her handwriting in the account books openly, beside her husband's steadily improving hand, and the house had about it, visitors remarked, a settled working sound it had not had in living memory, doors that opened without ceremony, a wheel turning a mile off that could be heard, on a still evening, from the park's own front steps, as though the whole estate had finally learned to breathe in time with it. Margaret Colley Denholm had stopped asking, somewhere in the long cold months of that first winter, to be seen. She had not asked for it again since, not because the wanting had left her, but because she had understood, standing ankle-deep in a flooded mill with a key knotted to her wrist. That a woman who waits to be seen is at the mercy of whoever is doing the looking, while a woman who simply builds, patiently, honestly, in full daylight, need not wait on anyone's attention at all. She had not been loved because she had proven herself useful. She had been useful for 2 long years, and had not, in all that time, been loved at all, and it was not her usefulness that changed that, in the end, but her refusal to keep being useful in silence, not because she had earned love through her labour, but because she had finally made herself impossible to mistake for merely convenient. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself, wheel by wheel and ledger by ledger, impossible to unsee, and that, whatever else the county's memory eventually softened or forgot, was not a thing that could ever again be taken from her.